Gentrification, the invisible process reshaping your city. Hey, curious minds. Today, we're going to talk about a word you've probably heard everywhere, gentrification. But do we really understand what it is? Spoiler alert, it's not just a neighborhood becoming trendy. It's a silent, almost invisible force that transforms entire cities and often pushes out the very people who gave them their soul. Get ready, because after this journey, I promise you'll never walk down your street the same way again. Let's start with what we all see on the surface. Gentrification, in its simplest form, is when a traditionally low-income or working-class neighborhood starts to welcome new, wealthier residents. Suddenly, you see old buildings getting renovated, coffee shops selling drinks with exotic names pop up, and designer boutiques appear where a family-run hardware store used to be. And of course, this drastically changes the prices. Rent goes through the roof. The coffee you used to get at the corner diner now costs 3 times as much at the trendy new spot. It's that exact moment when you look at the menu of a new restaurant on your own street and think, wait a minute, who can afford to eat here every day? But do you know where this word comes from? It's nothing new. It was coined by a British sociologist named Ruth Glass back in the 60s. She observed how the gentry, an old English word for the upper middle class, like a minor nobility, were moving back into working class neighborhoods in central London, gradually displacing the original inhabitants. It was, so to speak, a silent reconquest, but with money instead of swords. Okay. Renovated buildings, higher prices, new neighbors with different lifestyles. That's the tip of the iceberg, what we all see at a glance. But if this is what we see, what secret engines are driving it from below? What invisible forces decide which neighborhood is next on the list? Here comes the first major revelation. A large part of this phenomenon is explained by a key concept that urban economists call the rent gap. Imagine an old building in a central but somewhat neglected neighborhood. Its current rent is low, but its potential rent, if it were completely renovated and rented out to people with much more money, is sky high. That difference, that giant gap between what it's worth now and what it could be worth, is an irresistible magnet for money. Investors don't see an old building, they see a hidden treasure waiting to be polished. Understanding this rent gap gives you a new way to look at your city. On one hand, you can use it to spot opportunities. If you see a central, well-connected neighborhood with old buildings and prices that are still low, it's very likely that this gap exists and that investment is about to pour in. And this is crucial, it's also a tool for spotting risks. If you live in a neighborhood like that, that same gap is a red flag, a warning sign. It means the pressure for prices to rise and for you to potentially have to leave is immense. It's the same logic, just seen from the investor's chair or the tenant's. There's another invisible rule at play, one that has less to do with money and more to do with prestige. Sociologists call it symbolic capital. It's not about how much something costs, but how cool or authentic it seems. A working-class neighborhood, with its history, its murals, its unique flavor, has enormous cultural value. The first people to arrive, often artists or students, aren't looking for luxury. They're looking for precisely that authenticity. It's like when you choose a bar not because it's the fanciest, but because it has something, an atmosphere, a history. That something is symbolic capital, and it's the initial bait. This process almost always unfolds in waves. First come the cultural pioneers, then the media writes about the hot new neighborhood. And here, our brain plays a trick on us with a built-in flaw known as the bandwagon effect. It's our tendency to do or believe something simply because many other people are doing it. We see a neighborhood is popular and just assume it's good for us, without a second thought. To counteract this, we can use an incredibly useful mental strategy, first principles thinking. Instead of following the crowd, stop and ask yourself, what do I truly need in a neighborhood? Peace and quiet, proximity to my job, a sense of community, low prices? Break the problem down into its fundamental parts and decide based on your principles, not the latest trend. Think about it for a second. Since ancient times, humans have used their homes and their surroundings to signal their social status. Where you lived said who you were. Modern gentrification is a version of this behavior on steroids. Living in the it neighborhood of the moment isn't just a matter of convenience, it's a powerful statement of identity. The practical takeaway for today is to be brutally honest with ourselves. Am I choosing this place because it genuinely suits me and makes me happy, or because I want to project a certain image? Separating real need from the desire for status can save us a lot of money, and above all, a lot of headaches. If you've understood all these mechanisms, the most important real-life takeaway is this: gentrification is not an accident. It doesn't just happen out of the blue. It's a process with an internal, almost predictable logic. It follows the trail of capital, culture, and our own psychological biases. And that means that instead of being a passive victim of these changes, you can learn to read the signs, anticipate the moves, and make much more conscious decisions about where and how you want to live your life. With this new understanding, it feels like we finally have the treasure map, right? It seems like we understand the machine. But if you thought we had it all figured out, get ready, because this is where the story becomes a real mess of contradictions. Here lies the first great battle, the heart of the conflict. Is gentrification urban revitalization or forced displacement? On one hand, its defenders argue that it brings investment, reduces crime, improves public services, and revitalizes rundown areas of the city. For them, what's fundamentally at stake is progress and safety. On the other hand, its critics see it as a form of economic violence that pushes out lower-income communities, destroys local culture, and deepens inequality. For them, what's at stake is the right to the city, social justice, and the very soul of a neighborhood. Let's debunk a widespread myth, one we all like to believe, the myth that gentrification is always good for long-standing small businesses. Sounds logical, doesn't it? More people with money, more customers. But the reality, as shown by numerous studies from universities like Stanford, is much harsher. Often, the drastic rent hike on commercial properties is precisely what forces out the local grocery store or the tailor shop to make way for an international franchise or a luxury boutique. And why do we love to believe this myth? Because it offers us a simple, happy narrative. It allows us to see the change as a win-win situation, and that, let's be honest, soothes our conscience about the darker effects of the process. And this leads us to a terrible paradox, an almost philosophical dilemma with no easy solution. How can you improve a neighborhood without causing the displacement of the people who live there? Think about it. If you add a new park, better schools, more public transit, you make the neighborhood objectively a better place to live. By making it more attractive, its value goes up. And if its value goes up, people with fewer resources may no longer be able to afford it. It's a perverse trap. The very act of trying to improve a place can be the catalyst for displacing the very people you were, in theory, trying to help. Now let's take a more critical viewpoint. There's something most of us accept without question, the aesthetic of gentrification. Often, the process begins with a romanticization of the authenticity of a working-class neighborhood. Its character, its weathered facades, its industrial vibe are all valued. But let's pause here. Isn't there a deep ethical objection to this? Isn't this a form of aestheticizing poverty? In other words, treating the scars of economic hardship and lack of investment as if they were a vintage and authentic backdrop for the consumption of a more privileged class, completely ignoring the harsh reality of the people who live with those difficulties every day. Let's talk about another controversy that has changed dramatically over time, the role of artists. In the 70s and 80s, they were seen as brave pioneers, almost heroes, who moved into areas considered dangerous and filled them with life and creativity. Today, the debate is infinitely more bitter. Artists are often accused of being the unwitting vanguard of gentrification, the ones who, unintentionally, paved the way for major speculators. The question is no longer whether they have a role, but whether that role is one of an accomplice, a victim, or both at the same time. At the heart of this whole mess, gentrification forces us to confront a fundamental problem of the human condition, our eternal tension between community and the individual, between the feeling of belonging to a place and the desire for personal mobility and progress. Do we owe something to the place where we grew up? Do we have the right to seek the best opportunity for ourselves, even if it harms the community we leave behind? The city becomes the grand chessboard where this existential game is played, and there's no clear rule book. As you can see, this isn't a simple matter of good guys and bad guys. It's an incredibly complex tangle of good intentions, unintended consequences, brutal economic forces, and deep human dilemmas. You've survived the chaos. Now it's time to dive into the details that separate the curious from the true connoisseurs of the subject. Let's get to the expert level. We almost always think of gentrification as something driven by private companies, by real estate developers. But there's a phenomenon that specialists call state-led gentrification. This happens when the government itself, through changes in zoning laws, the construction of major projects like stadiums or convention centers, or by giving huge tax breaks to certain companies, becomes the main driver of change. It's not a private investor, it's the city council itself that is deliberately laying the groundwork for the neighborhood to be transformed. Behind this, there's often a very technical financial mechanism, but I'm going to explain it with an analogy so it's perfectly clear. It's called tax increment financing, or TIF. Imagine the city tells a major investor, redevelop this entire abandoned area. For the next 20 years, all the extra tax money generated by the new luxury buildings and businesses won't go into the city's general fund. Instead, it will be used to pay off the debt from this very redevelopment. It's basically like using a future credit card to pay for today's construction. The catch is that this new money, which could go toward improving schools or healthcare for the rest of the city, gets locked up for decades to benefit a single project. While Ruth Glass, whom we mentioned earlier, coined the term, it was an often overlooked Scottish geographer named Neil Smith who revolutionized everything in the 70s and 80s. He was the true architect of the rent gap theory we explained at the beginning. Smith was a kind of secret hero because at a time when everyone was talking about tastes, culture, and lifestyles, he slammed his fist on the table and said, "Hey, follow the money!" His great contribution was arguing that gentrification wasn't a matter of people looking for nice neighborhoods, but of capital coldly and calculatingly seeking the maximum possible profit. He shifted the focus of the analysis from culture to economics. But there's an even more radical theory, a rebellious perspective that goes one step further. It was proposed by the geographer Loretta Lees, and she called it super gentrification. What she says is that in major global cities like London, Paris, or New York, the game has changed. We're no longer talking about the upper middle class displacing the working class. Now we're seeing the super rich, the global financial elite, displacing even the very same upper middle class that gentrified those neighborhoods in the first place. It's the gentrification of the gentrifiers themselves, a whole different league of power and money. Now, for a detail from scientific research that directly clashes with our intuition. We tend to think that displacement happens directly. The landlord raises your rent, you can't pay it, you have to leave. And that does happen, of course. But many studies, like those from the Urban Displacement Project at UC Berkeley, show that much of the displacement is indirect, or as they call it, exclusionary. This means people aren't necessarily actively forced out. Instead, when they move for normal life reasons, a new job, a growing family, they can no longer afford to move back into their own neighborhood. And more importantly, new people with similar incomes can no longer afford to move in. The neighborhood quietly closes itself off like an invisible fortress. And here comes the aha moment where several ideas we've seen connect in an amazing way. Remember how at the beginning we talked about symbolic capital, that cultural authenticity sought by artists and pioneers? And remember how we just talked about state-led gentrification? Well, here's the connection. Very often governments and large investors use that symbolic capital as a tool. They watch which neighborhoods are becoming cool and authentic thanks to cultural pioneers, and that's precisely where they direct their major investments and urban policies, accelerating and magnifying the process on a brutal scale. Artists unintentionally become free scouts for big capital. Suddenly it all clicks into place. This level of detail gives us a much sharper, and sometimes, let's be honest, a much more cynical view of the whole process. It's no longer an inexplicable mystery, it's a machine with very identifiable parts, gears, and operators. We've reached the edge of what is known. Do you dare to look with me toward the final frontier, toward what is not yet, but could be? Let's look to the future, let's get speculative. In 100 years, maybe the debate won't be about physical neighborhoods, but about digital gentrification. As our lives increasingly take place in virtual worlds in what they call the metaverse, couldn't identical processes emerge? Exclusive digital spaces whose rents or access costs skyrocket, pushing out the early users who made them interesting, and thus creating new and unimaginable forms of inequality and status in cyberspace. And this brings us to the fundamental question, the exact point where economic science gives up and philosophy must take over. Who does a neighborhood truly belong to? Does it belong to those who were born there? To those who legally own the property? To those who invest their money in it? Or does it belong to those who contribute every day to its culture, its life, and its soul? There is no scientific answer to this. It's a question of values, a question about what kind of society we want to build. Perhaps the most dizzying philosophical implication of all this is that gentrification shows us that a place is not just a physical container filled with buildings. A place is, above all, a social construct, an incredibly dense network of meanings, shared memories, and human relationships. And when a process like gentrification sweeps through a neighborhood, it's not just changing bricks and raising prices. It is actively erasing an entire version of reality to write a completely new one over it. And here there is a glimmer of hope. Deeply understanding these mechanisms could be the key to solving one of humanity's greatest challenges this century, the global housing crisis and the creation of cities that are both sustainable and just. If we manage to design policies that achieve what seems impossible, improving neighborhoods without displacing their communities, protecting the vulnerable while encouraging investment, we won't just be solving a local problem. We will be creating a model for an inevitably urban future. And I leave you with this final thought, the most provocative and open-ended statement of the entire video. Perhaps gentrification isn't a failure of the system. Perhaps gentrification is the modern capitalist system working perfectly, doing exactly what it was designed to do, prioritize a place's exchange value over its use value. Prioritizing economic profit over the human home? Our journey through the hidden mechanisms of gentrification has come to an end. Now it's time to take a step back, take a deep breath, and survey the incredible landscape we've uncovered together. At the beginning of this journey, we started with a very simple and familiar idea. We talked about gentrification as something you see at a glance. A new coffee shop on the corner, a freshly painted building, a neighborhood that suddenly becomes trendy. And now look where we've ended up. Now we see a highly complex and sometimes brutal dance between global financial capital, a city's urban policies, our own cognitive biases, and the deepest philosophical questions about who a city belongs to. We've gone from seeing a simple new shop to understanding one of the most powerful forces reshaping the reality of millions of people across the planet. The transformation of our perspective has been enormous. Which idea from this entire journey struck you the most? Was it the concept of the rent gap, the painful paradox of improvement, or that futuristic idea of super gentrification? I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for dedicating your time and attention to this deep dive. I would genuinely love to read your own thoughts in the comments. How has this process affected your city, your neighborhood, your own life? If you're fascinated by these journeys that take reality apart to understand it better, piece by piece, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. I promise you, there's a whole universe of fascinating topics waiting for us. Until next time, and as always, keep questioning everything and never ever stop looking beneath the surface. The next time you walk down your street, what will you see now?